Hi, Matt here from the Massage Collective. This is the third video in this trilogy where we're exploring what it means when we talk about evidence-based practice and how as massage therapists we go about finding good, reliable sources of evidence. If you need to catch up on videos 1 and 2, you can find them in the links in the comments below, but in this video we're going to dive into the nuts and bolts of an original research paper and how to interpret what is, admittedly, not most people's idea of a good night in. But it is super important for your career as an evidence-based massage therapist. We're not going to go in too heavy, as there's a lot to cover about types of studies and statistical analysis, etc. But that's probably another couple of videos. So today we're going to simply look at a standalone paper. Research, or papers as they're more commonly known, are pieces of scientific literature that are published in scientific journals. Unfortunately, whilst the research is often performed using public money, many journals publish papers behind paywalls, which can make it challenging for the average massage therapist to access them. Now, there are some good arguments for paying for such a setup, such as the promotion of the researchers' work, protection of their work, and decent infrastructure for us to use when looking for information. This isn't a for or against the process of publishing, but instead I'm going to point you towards useful databases such as Google Scholar and PubMed, and point out that there are an increasing number of open access papers and journals, which means you can get to them for free. And if you really want to get hold of a paper that's behind a paywall, then my suggestion would be to email the author. They'll be thrilled that you've been in contact and will often happily discuss their work with you. As a slight segue, I think it's safe to assume that we all recognise there is a difference in quality between your average book and a New York Times bestseller, or the type of novel that you were made to study in school English lessons. We might not have appreciated it then, but there is a quality to Pride and Prejudice that sits above the likes of a Mills and Boon. Why is this relevant? Because the same goes for research papers and indeed the journals that publish them. And so we need to be careful not to take them at face value. First of all, you need to take the view on the journal that is publishing the paper in question. There are a few big name journals out there which are famous for their high quality, and although they're not infallible, if a paper you're interested in is published in them, it's a very good place to start. Of course, certain disciplines can have their own niche journals, but papers from the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, the British Journal of Sports Medicine, the BJSM, the New England Journal of Medicine, Science and Nature can generally be viewed positively. The downside of many articles being behind paywalls is that often the only free bit, used as a bit of a teaser, is what is known as the abstract. This is the first paragraph of an article which allows the author to give the reader an overview of the problem or question and their approach and rationale for it, as well as an interpretation of the results. This can be super helpful in determining whether a paper has any relevance to you or just happened to be included in one of your search terms. But we also need to be really careful if starting making statements based on reading just the abstract. Why? Well, the sharp-eared among you will have heard me say that the abstract provides the author's interpretation of the experiment and its results. The abstract is essentially the author's opinion, and they're expressing it in the hope that you will read the rest of the paper or even cite it. Citations are a big deal to researchers. It's the scientific literature version of a thumbs up emoji, retweet and channel subscription all in one. So use the abstract to filter out papers, but don't rely on their contents. For that we need to delve deeper. So next is the introduction. Now this is where the authors summarise and cite the existing research on their topic in order to position why their new study is needed. This can be a good place to start because it gives you more objective context, although we need to be a little wary as some researchers cherry pick the references they use. Have a look through the references to see if they are familiar, and maybe look at a couple just to satisfy yourself that they aren't totally obscure. Methods is the next section. This is where the researchers describe exactly what they did and how they did it. This section is usually very matter of fact, with no room for opinion, as reviewers will go through this with a fine-tooth comb to ensure that well-established research methods were used. For a paper to stand up to scrutiny longer term, the results of the paper need to be able to be repeated under the same study conditions. These conditions are what are laid out in the methods, so you tend to be able to rely on them. The methods section can be really detailed, more so than we really need as massage therapists, but there are some key bits of info to glean from it. The first is the type of participant. Are they single-gendered, a narrow age group, sufferers of a specific condition, participants in a particular sport, etc.? Individual papers tend to be narrow in their scope in order to be able to draw sensible conclusions, so knowing the type of group studied is useful when considering the impact of the research on you and your practice. If you work with female youth footballers, research on sedate middle-aged men with high BMI might not be the most applicable, even if it is focused on rehabilitation of lower limb injuries, which is what you'd searched for. The next key bit to pull out from the data is the sample size studied. A conclusion drawn on the outcome of 5 test subjects is going to be less reliable than that which comes from a group of hundreds. That doesn't mean the paper is less valuable, but it does need to be considered carefully. You might hear such papers referred to as showing promising results, rather than sets a new standard for treatment. The results sections come next, and they again tend to be reliable in the sense that it is rare for researchers to simply make up data. It has happened, but they usually get found out pretty quickly. Again, from our perspective as massage therapists, there is a lot of detail here we don't need to get too deep into unless you're making career-defining decisions based on it, or have a specialist interest. Skimming the headlines is good enough, although this is where you will first come across the p-value, a seemingly magical number that will crop up later and I'll discuss shortly. The figures, the graphs and tables are a good way to gauge the overall impact of the intervention being studied. The final 2 sections are the discussion and conclusions. They are similar but different. The discussion is the author's interpretation of the results. It is an opinion. True, it may be a very well-informed opinion, so we need to judge it carefully, but it is an opinion all the same. Often you'll see phrases like, the results suggest X, or the concept is supported by these results, and more studies are needed. That's a popular one. Also with reference to the almighty p-value. Essentially, don't use the ideas in this section as references of fact. The author will acknowledge the limitations of the study, such as sample size or demographic studied, so it's actually a good place to check your earlier notes on this from the method. The conclusion puts the study and its results back into the context of the wider base of research that was set out in the introduction. Oddly, if you've already identified that this paper is relevant to you and your area of interest, this can actually be a better place to start than the introduction. Because if the conclusion is fairly muted and doesn't seem to offer much new or substantial evidence, you can save time not reading the whole paper. On the other hand, if the conclusion seems too good to be true or seems to make a leap from the study of worms to the application, say, in humans, you can read the paper with an element of skepticism and make sure that the results really do reflect the sometimes over-exuberance of the author. And if they do, then brilliant. So let's quickly return to the mysterious p-value and the role it plays when you hear discussions between statistical and clinical relevance. The p-value in scientific papers is often represented as p is less than 0.05 or p is equal to 0.0342 and is seen sat next to some results and is calculated using some statistical analysis. What this notation is saying, however, is that the probability of these results of this experiment occurring as a result of random chance rather than as a result of a true effect is less than 5%. 5% is the value commonly picked for these types of studies that we will come across, but for some studies this value needs to be even smaller. In either case, if your calculated p-value is lower than the percentage that has been predetermined for your field of study, you can be confident in saying that the results measured have statistical significance and that the effect you have witnessed in your study as a result of your intervention is real. Hooray! Or is it? This is where we need to be super careful as therapists reading papers. because often statistical significance is confused with clinical significance. What's the difference? Clinical significance is a reflection of the impact of the intervention being tested on clinical practice. As a silly example, let's say I'm comparing the immediately reported pain levels of two groups of clients after receiving a different type of treatment. The first group, I'm giving a nice relaxing massage. The second, I'm giving a boiled sweet. Both treatments elicit feelings of happiness and reduce reported pain. The massage reduces pain by 5 points on average, the boiled sweet by 1. Statistical analysis tells me that both reductions are statistically significant. It is a real effect and not just random chance. But in a clinical context, is a reduction of just 1 on this particular pain scale really that significant to me or my clients? Is it significant enough for my clients to spend their time and money coming to see me, or indeed for me to continue researching into the efficacy of boiled sweets in the reduction of pain? This is a question we need to ask ourselves regularly when reading papers. Whilst I could legitimately publish a paper and conclude that boiled sweets produced statistically significant reductions in pain, analysis of my data would show that this is not an area worth spending much time in, and therefore that other treatments were more likely to be beneficial in a clinical context, which fundamentally is where we practice. So there you have it, the Massage Collective's short guide to reading a paper. We love feedback, and so any questions at all, please pop them in the comments below. Whilst you're there, hit subscribe and come and follow us on Facebook, and we'll see you in the next one.